Okay, I think I'm going to get started and people filter
Is your
in.
name teacher?
Sorry? Oh, I think
Kann ich deinen
someone's,
Kopfhörer nehmen?
Mhm.
Oder soll ich deine Kopfhörer nehmen?
I think someone needs to mute if possible. I think Salim. Thank you. Great. All right. So I'm going to begin. So this is the teaching on Adorno's Dialectics held by the Cincinnati chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society. For those who don't know about the Platypus Affiliated Society, we are an organization that organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 1930s, the new 1960s to 1970s, and post-political 1980s to 1990s left for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. We have chapters all around the world. And for those interested in reading our paper, The Platypus Review, or finding a chapter around you, in the context of COVID, we've also been hosting our reading groups online. So if you're interested in finding a reading group online to join, you can visit our website at platypus1917.org. Okay. So I'm just going to read the Facebook event for this event and then present my paper because I want to leave a lot of time for question and answer and discussion at the end. Okay. This online teaching aims to address Adorno's Dialectics as a method of social and historical critique that provides insight into the method and content of Marx's own critique of capitalism. An exploration of Adorno's Dialectics, or in other words, Adorno's Marxism, illuminates the character of not only Marx's dialectical treatment of capitalism, but of the relationship between Marx's dialectical method and Hegel's, the relationship between Marxism and the radical bourgeois thought that preceded it. This teaching will consist of a presentation by Omer Hussein of his paper Adorno's Dialectics, Freedom in Crisis, followed by Q&A. No background reading is required for the event, but for those interested in understanding Hegel's dialectics, what both Marx and Adorno's critical method assumes, see Omer Hussein's article in issue 135 of the Platypus Review, titled Hegel's Dialectics, Non-Identity, Contradiction, and Freedom, some of the content of which will be revisited in this teaching. All right, so I'm just going to jump into my paper. One sec. Okay, so the paper is called Adorno's Dialectics, Freedom in Crisis. In his 1951 book, Minima Moralia, Reflections from Damaged Life, Adorno writes, "Wrong life cannot be lived rightly." The book, whose title is an inverted reference to Aristotle's Magna Moralia, addresses the fate and status of a traditional philosophical concern, the teaching of the good life. Adorno's assessment is that the social and historical conditions of possibility that allowed philosophy to pursue the question of the good life had been undermined in such a way and to such an extent that the good life might no longer be possible. Life itself for Adorno has become wrong, false. In a recent Facebook post, Adorno scholar Chris Catrone adds another claim to Adorno's, a claim that I would argue is already contained in Adorno's, a claim that I would argue is already contained in Adorno's original proposition and is something he addresses both implicitly and explicitly throughout his work. Catrone writes, "Wrong life cannot be thought rightly." To follow the logic of Minima Moralia, this statement suggests that the very social and historical conditions of possibility that allowed for philosophy to pursue the question of truth, that allowed for ideas to be able to make sense of the world coherently, has been undermined to such an extent that our very attempts to theorize the world, to pursue the truth of reality, are inherently wrong and false. There's a lot to unpack in these two pithy propositions. In this paper, I want to address the meaning of these two claims, an effort that I think will get us to the heart of the content of Adorno's dialectics. I would argue that Adorno's dialectics attempts to maintain fidelity to Marx's dialectics in the context of altered historical conditions, in the absence and liquidation of what Marx's own thought could assume, a mass working class political project struggling for socialism. In this regard, I would suggest that Adorno's dialectics might illuminate the content of Marx's dialectical critique of capitalism. Adorno self-consciously understood this as his task, to recover the original Marxist dialectical method in changed historical circumstances. Additionally, Adorno's dialectics raises the often vexing and misunderstood problem of the relationship between Marxist dialectics and Hegel's, or more generally, the relationship between Marxism and the bourgeois project of emancipation that preceded it, the relationship between the bourgeois revolution and the socialist revolution. Adorno, as a good follower of Marx, attempts to address the same question Marx poses in the 1844 manuscripts. How do we now stand as regards the Hegelian dialectic? Adorno's dialectics is an attempt to grapple with this problem. Perhaps the first thing to address is the category of wrong life. How can life be wrong or false? Common sense tells us that our own thinking and actions might be wrong or false to the extent that they misperceive reality. In common sense, we correct our wrong thinking and actions by getting a more adequate grasp on reality. But what does it mean to say that reality itself might be wrong and false, not just our thinking and actions? To understand that claim requires addressing the concept of the true Adorno is assuming. What is the true that reality is falsifying? To put it another way, if Adorno's concern is with a critical theory of society, with the assertion of the falseness of reality as part of this critical project, from what ground does Adorno offer his critique? According to what criteria does Adorno come to the conclusion that life has become wrong? It is in regard to these questions that Adorno fully inhabits Marx's dialectical method of critique. One of the most significant aspects of Marx's thought, and what separates it from most critiques of capitalism, is that Marx grounds his own thought and action as the product and expression of the very same society he is critiquing and ultimately trying to overcome. Rather than understanding his thought as an antidote to capitalism, an abstract ideal or ought counterposed to a bad reality, Marx recognizes that his own thought and politics are the most acute expression of the crisis that capitalism is. This self-recognition of being immanent to the object of his critique, Marx's awareness that he is critiquing capitalism on the basis of capitalism itself, is expressed in Marx's treatment of bourgeois thought. Marx never understood his own thinking as lying outside the realm of bourgeois thought. Marx's own self-understanding was not that he was offering a critique from a separate proletarian standpoint. As Lukács puts in History and Class Consciousness, there is no standpoint within capitalism that is not bourgeois. Marx was not rejecting bourgeois thought as simply false, did not understand himself to be providing a corrected way of understanding the world in contradistinction to bourgeois thought. Rather, Marx is aware that his own work is deeply steeped in the tradition of radical bourgeois thought. Marx is self-consciously inheriting the bourgeois project of freedom. His critique of bourgeois thought, of the work of figures like Adam Smith and Hegel, is not that they got it wrong and that Marx now has it right. Rather, like his critique of capitalism, Marx's critiques of figures like Smith and Hegel, and especially their followers, is itself based on Smith and Hegel's own thought. Marx understands his treatment of bourgeois thought not as a refutation, nor an affirmation, but instead as the most acute self-consciousness of the fact that bourgeois thought and its project of freedom has come into conflict with itself. Adorno's assertion about the falseness of reality must be understood as embodying the same kind of critique, an immanent critique of society on the basis of its own self-understanding. For Adorno, reality in capitalism has become false, the extent to which it has fallen below its own bourgeois concept, as articulated by radical bourgeois thinkers like Hegel. For Hegel, truth, or what he calls the absolute, is the process in which a subject comes to recognition of its own freedom through its realization that it is transforming the objectivity that it seeks to know and that conditions its own existence. As Hegel asserts, history is this process, the story of freedom, the story of transformation driven by the self-consciousness of society, driven by the dialectic of humanity as both the subject and the object of the social historical process. This claim has radical implications for what counts as reality or objectivity. For Hegel, reality, objectivity, is not something we are simply subject to, an alien force we are forced to submit ourselves to. Rather, reality is a process of freedom in which we come to recognize ourselves as participating through our social relations in the constitution of objectivity itself. Hegel's dialectic is an account of the true reality as a process of transformation and freedom. Adorno's assertion that reality has become false gets at the core of the relationship between Hegel's dialectics and Marx's. Adorno's dialectic, following Marx's own dialectic, is an account of the disintegration of the Hegelian dialectic, an account of the undermining of the Hegelian dialectic by the very same process Hegel grasped dialectically as the movement of freedom. If Hegel's dialectics tells the story of freedom, Adorno's dialectics, like Marx, attempts to comprehend how a historical movement whose content was once freedom has come into contradiction with itself to the extent that this very same process now appears to dominate us as a condition of unfreedom. His dialectic seeks to grasp the process by which history transformed from being the story of freedom in Hegel to history as a nightmare that weighs on the brains of the living, Marx. Adorno's dialectic is an account of the historical process by which history has disintegrated. One way of getting at the relationship between Hegel's dialectic and Marx's, whose method Adorno seeks to maintain fidelity to, is in the distinct treatment of labor in Hegel and Marx. For Hegel, labor is the source of the dialectic because it is through labor that the subject comes to awareness of its ability to transform objectivity, to transform the conditions that condition him. Through labor, the subject transforms the given world, arriving at the recognition of his own freedom, recognizing his participation in the constitution of objective reality, recognizing his ability to transform reality and thus transform himself. In contrast, Marx, in the context of the Industrial Revolution and mass proletarianization, introduces the categories of alienated labor and necessary misrecognition. For Marx, the activity of labor as a mediation of our social relations, which for Hegel was the site of the recognition and constitution of our freedom, becomes in capitalism precisely the site of our necessary misrecognition of the way in which we are constituting our unfreedom. Many poor readers of Marx treat his category of ideology as a sort of mask that blinds people to the true reality that exists objectively. They treat Marxism, They treat Marxism as a way of removing the mask, of providing true insight into the nature of things that people are too stupid to see because they are blinded by ideology. What is not comprehended is that Marx's category of necessary misrecognition is based on Hegel's notion of recognition. For Hegel, labor allows us, can someone mute, please? Sorry. What is not comprehended is that Marx's category of necessary misrecognition is based on Hegel's notion of recognition. For Hegel, labor allows us to recognize our freedom in transforming reality. Hegel's notion of recognition is the recognition of ourselves as subjects that can change the objective circumstances that govern us. For Marx, what is necessarily misrecognized as a function of alienated labor is the way in which we are participating in the objective reality that appears to dominate us. It's not a matter of misrecognizing an objective reality people are blind to as a function of ideology. Rather, it's that what is misrecognized is how our own activity is constituting the objective reality we seek to know and change. In Marx, rather, it's that what is misrecognized is how our own activity is constituting the objective reality we seek to know and change. In Marx, this problem is addressed as an expression of the historically specific contradiction between capital and labor. Our labor, the way in which we participate in social reality, confronts us as capital, an alien force with a logic of its own that dominates us. For Marx, capitalism is a crisis of the Hegelian subject-object dialectic, a crisis of bourgeois freedom. In capitalism, the bourgeois dialectic undermines itself. In a society mediated by labor, the subject no longer recognizes himself in the true product of his labor, which is objective reality. Rather, objective reality, constituted by his labor, confronts him as something out of his control, as an omnipotent God that has fated him to unfreedom. A process that was supposed to amount to humanity's conscious mastery of the objective conditions that governed it, to Marx appears to have resulted in its opposite, its mastery over us. This is what is contained in Marx's category of capital. Adorno's claim about the falseness of reality is an attempt to critically reflect on this condition. For Adorno, reality has become false to the extent to which we are no longer able to recognize our participation in constituting it. Catrone's added claim that wrong life cannot be thought rightly suggests that there is a relationship between a false objectivity and an equally false subjective consciousness attempting to understand it. But again, the question is posed, false in what way? And if our consciousness of our objective situation is necessarily and inherently false, we must address the obvious implications this has for how we understand the role of theory. What is the role of thought in a historical context in which our thinking is necessarily wrong? This problem is what Adorno's dialectics takes on. Hegel's dialectic was meant to grasp the productive non-identity between humanity as both the subject and object of freedom in history. He recognized the way in which both subjectivity and objectivity were mutually conditioning moments in a process of unfolding transformation and freedom. The problem Adorno faces, following Marx, is that in capitalism, this dialectical process seems to undermine itself. If capitalism is the crisis of the bourgeois dialectic, in which the dialectic seems to break down at the hands of the same process it unleashed, this crisis expresses itself as a crisis of both objectivity and subjectivity. In capitalism, subjects no longer are able to recognize themselves in the objectivity they participate in constituting through the social activity of labor. What was a productive non-identity, or dialectic for Hegel, in which subject and object mutually conditioned, recognized, and transformed each other precisely through the difference existing between them, for Marx and Adorno becomes a disintegrative or negative dialectic, in which the non-identity between subject and object has broken down into a non-relation. In which the non-identity between subject and object has broken down into a non-relation. In capitalism, the subjective and objective moments of the bourgeois dialectic confront each other as inherently opposed aspects of reality that aren't able to be related or reconciled. Why is this the case? Because capitalism is the self-contradiction of what mediated the original bourgeois dialectic, what mediated subjectivity and objectivity for Hegel, labor. What made the relationship between subject and object possible to grasp for Hegel, labor, in Marx's time becomes opposed to itself as expressed in the antagonism between capital and labor. The antagonism between capital and labor is an expression of the self-contradictory character bourgeois labor comes to have in capitalism. The fact that the subject in capitalism can no longer recognize himself in the objectivity he is reproducing through labor means that both subjectivity and objectivity disintegrate, or in Adorno's terms, become false. Adorno, like Marx, seeks to ground his thought in his own historical moment. He recognizes that to assert the necessary falseness of all subjective reflection implicates his own theoretical work as well. How can one recognize that the wrong life still needs to be thought about, while recognizing that this thinking will inevitably still be wrong, imminent to the false reality it attempts to grasp? Adorno's Dialectics confronts the question of the role of our necessarily bourgeois consciousness in the historical context of the self-contradiction and self-undermining of what conditioned the possibility of bourgeois consciousness in the first place, labor. What is the role of bourgeois thought when the basic conditions of its intelligibility are disintegrating before one's eyes? Adorno's response is an emulation of Marx's own method. What is required by thought in this crisis-ridden situation is not the assertion of positive truths, but the self-conscious expression of the awareness that thought has come into contradiction with itself, that its conditions of possibility are being undermined to such an extent that thought's only role might be to critically raise the awareness of its own impossibility. The hard idea to grasp is that for Adorno, bourgeois thought is necessary in capitalism precisely to the extent that it might be able to express its own disintegration. The real injustice done to Adorno at the hands of the New Left and through its reception of his work is the idea that Adorno's criticism of student activism in the 60s was about a rejection of practice and action in favor of theory and thinking. The point of Adorno's critique of 60s student politics is completely misunderstood. Adorno had no aversion to practice. In fact, like the good bourgeois dialecticians before him, Adorno recognized that reflection on practical activity was necessary to be able to formulate theoretical claims at all. Adorno recognized that actually the non-identity of theory and practice in bourgeois thought was emancipatory, because both mediated and co-constituted each other through their difference, transforming both each other and objectivity, driving the dialectical movement of freedom. The point of Adorno's critique of the 60s radicals was that what they affirmed as practice and action fell well below the threshold of the concept of practice as formulated by bourgeois thought. For bourgeois thought, practice was the process by which a subjective action transformed a given object, and through reflecting on this process, came to a theoretical recognition of his freedom. For Adorno, capitalism is not only the disintegration of the bourgeois dialectic of subject and object, but also of the disintegration of the related bourgeois dialectic of theory and practice. For Adorno, the 60s emphasis on practice and action was hollow, a rationalization for what he called pseudo-activity, activity that was a farce of what practice and action once meant, the transformation of objectivity by the subject. For Adorno, the so-called political action of the 60s radicals was actually a theatrical display of their own impotence in regard to their ability to actually transform the objective world, this itself being driven by desperation at the theoretical recognition they had to actively repress, which was that their own activity and attempts to change the world might be pointless and futile. Despite being critical of the rationalizations they offered for their activities, Adorno was actually very sympathetic to the plight of 60s radicals, but because he recognized that he was embedded in the same problem. Adorno realized that if the 60s radicals represented a vain and often delusional attempt at practice in the face of its impossibility, then this condition of the seeming impossibility of political practice also expressed itself as the impossibility of theory and thinking. Adorno's dialectical account of the disintegration of the bourgeois dialectic, if properly grasped, should challenge the majority of the interpretations of Marxism on offer by the dead left today. Adorno's work embodies the self-conscious recognition that he is pursuing the necessary task of theory, only to raise to critical recognition the insight that, in the absence and liquidation of a socialist politics aimed at changing the world in its totality, the possibility of providing a theoretical account of society in its totality is liquidated too. Despite operating in the context of a regressed historical situation, Adorno's negative dialectic provides insight into the original point of departure from Marx's own method and his self-understanding of his work. Adorno's Marxism illuminates Marx's thought as negative in character, not concerned with providing a positive theoretical analysis of capitalism or communism, but as Marx writes to his friend Arnold Ruga in 1843, a project which aims to find the new world only through the criticism of the old. Okay, so yeah, that's the paper presentation, and now we should just open it up for question and discussion. And if someone has a question, I mean, I think it's a pretty small group, so if you just want to unmute yourself and ask away, maybe introduce.
I do actually have a question, and my question is, it's clear that based on what you're describing, Adorno sincerely believes that the goal of that under capitalism, bourgeois thought is undermined by basically capitalism itself. And the foundations of bourgeois thought is undermined. Does this mean, what approach would he therefore take if he believes thought is being made impossible? It doesn't seem like he would endorse postmodernism or relativism. So what belief system or what sort of, I mean, critique is one thing, but critique has to be built on something, and ultimately you'd think there have to be a new construction of thought. Does he believe that's only possible once there is once subjectivity is actually able to be asserted via the overthrow of capitalism? What does he believe at that point?
So it's interesting. I mean, Benjamin, and there's a sense in which if our reflection on society as a function of being alienated from objectivity is necessarily false, then this is the reason why Marxists don't indulge in a kind of depiction of what thought or philosophy or thinking will be after the revolution, right? Because our attempt to grapple with that problem is inherently an expression of a kind of false subjectivity and objectivity in the sense I presented in the paper, which is that it's reified or alienated, in which the very fact that it seems like we have to reflect on a world contemplatively rather than understanding it through our practical engagements, that itself is a symptom of the kind of problem we're dealing with. And so I think Adorno's critique of things like relativism and postmodernism, and even Heidegger, for example, is not, again, that they're getting it wrong, but rather that they're expressing the fact that we're all getting it wrong, and how can we understand the ways they're getting it wrong as a symptom of the problem. And the last thing I'll say, which really addresses your question, Benjamin has a formulation, though Marxists don't kind of indulge in a kind of conception of what socialism will look like. Benjamin has the idea that new forms of social relations will produce new forms of knowledge, qualitatively new forms of knowledge, which, we can't really grasp what that means on this side of capitalism. But that is the idea that a transformation, a kind of dealing with the Hegelian problem of subjectivity and objectivity co-constituting each other, once the task of socialism is achieved, in that sense, the subject-object dialectic might itself be overcome, that we might understand the world in terms differently than a subject reflecting on an object, because that is a kind of expression of labor as value for bourgeois, or labor for bourgeois thought. And so for overcoming labor, we might overcome the basic subject-object dialectic as the way of knowing the world. Does that address your question?
I believe so, yes, thank you.
Sure. All right, we'll do Will. Will, if you want to speak, and then Justin.
Hey, yeah, thanks. I think I want to ask about just the use of the word false, because like how much mileage we can get out of it, and how much what it can't do, because it seems like you're using it and then you're explaining it in a way that is actually describing self-contradiction rather than a kind of notion of like truth and false. And I guess my point is just that it almost seems like it would be, there's a certain just like colloquial rhetorical use mileage that you can get out of, like, you know, saying that the world we live in, capitalist society, is false. Therefore, our kind of immediate reactions to it in theory and practice are also false. It almost seems like that would be amenable to a political project, like an actual socialist movement or party, to kind of use that rhetoric. But to what extent does it not capture the fact that falsity is not the same as self-contradiction, and that, you know, an anarchist kind of rejection and even kind of reactionary conservative, let's go back before capitalism, could possibly be the result of kind of calling reality and capitalism false rather than self-contradictory?
I think that's a good question. I mean, and that's, you know, when Adorno says wrong life, you know, that's the only other way that that expression is used, is by a kind of religious meaning, right? That we're condemned to a wrong life, that capitalism is a violation of, you know, religious principles or other forms of society prior to capitalism. And so there's a way in which what you're suggesting, Will, is true, that to say reality is false or wrong might kind of suggest a critique from without, a critique from past forms of social life that we then judge capitalism as a moral aberration of. So you're right that I think Adorno's point is to raise falseness as a contradiction, as a moment of contradiction. I mean, the reason it's false is because he recognizes that there's no escaping it. I mean, even the way you formulated the problem, right? There's a false objectivity, and thus we have a false thinking. For Adorno, even formulating the problem that way is an expression of falseness, because it's treating subjectivity and objectivity as separate, which is true in capitalism. That's how it appears. But to call it false is to say that our basic way of understanding the world is false to the extent to which the dialectic of subject and object as a practical one has kind of disintegrated. You know, but something Chris wanted me to bring up, which I think gets to this question, is there's an essay by Marcuse called Note on Dialectic. And the essay ends with a line that, you know, Chris has suggested to me, and I agree, that summarizes Adorno's thought, which is that the whole is true, which is Hegel, and the whole is false. So that kind of formulation, it seemed, I didn't want to use it because it's very, you know, it seems kind of nonsensical almost. But the point being that for Hegel, the truth is in the whole, speculatively, in the process in its totality. And Adorno says that is also true, but the whole we're dealing with is false to the extent to which it's fallen below that concept of truth for Hegel, which is the transformation of objectivity and subjectivity in a process. But you're right, falseness is about a contradiction, not a kind of moral shock at the world. Is that okay? Justin, you want to go ahead? Well, what were you going to say?
I said thanks.
Okay, Justin.
And so I thought your presentation brought up a very good point, which was Adorno's critique of the New Left, and specifically its empathetic character, that Adorno was recognizing that he himself had to confront the problems that the New Left did. And I think this kind of touches on some issues with, you know, regarding the triangulation of platypus and the left today, particularly like issues of smartism. So I just wanted to ask how we could possibly bring to bear this sort of empathetic character of Adorno's critique on the left today, specifically as regards like the transition point that we're sort of now past between neoliberalism and post-neoliberalism, as we find the left sort of liquidating the Biden administration, and consequently this sort of tendency for platypus to get misrecognized as a positive project, you know, following the liquidation of the left. It gets misrecognized as positive because there's this sort of idea that it's preserving the memory of Marxism in sort of an exegetical sense. And I just wanted to sort of raise that in relation to smartism and the sort of need to empathize with the left today.
Sure. You know, I think because when Adorno is critical of something, once again, this is why I was trying to talk about where he's grounding his critique from. People assume that he's like saying this is bad from this standpoint that's other than the one he's critiquing. From the outside, he's saying, okay, the New Left was bad or something, as if he's imputing the truth. And, you know, one thing I was picking up on in this teaching, he has a line, I think, in one of his lectures, which is that true consciousness has never existed to this day, in the sense that he recognizes his own work as an expression of false consciousness. And so I think that's important and something to stress, and that Platypus tries to stress in its activity, is that we're not coming from a place of knowing better. of having a better grasp on reality. Rather, we're doing, in some sense, in a very Adornian fashion, is expressing the fact that, you know, we're faced with a problem of even both changing the world, but also knowing it. We're the most self-consciously aware of the fact that the dialectic of bourgeois society is disintegrated, that the dialectic of theory and practice is disintegrated, in which both are kind of rendered impotent. And I think it's something we should stress, and hopefully to newer members is stressed, and I think we do stress it, which is that we're not here to correct the left. We're not here to provide the actual insight into the world that the left is misrecognizing. Rather, what we're trying to do is express the problem that we think the left just denies for the sake of the struggle continues. Our point is that, you know, is the dialectic relevant? Is Marxism relevant? I mean, what is the path forward for socialism? The extent to which it appears as a contemplative question of what to do in a reading group, figuring out in a reading group, you know, we recognize our own activity as a symptom of regression. I don't know, does that kind of address that?
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, great answer.
Tom, did you want to ask a question? Tom Cannell.
Sorry about that. I'm having some trouble unmuting myself. First of all, that was a brilliant presentation. Thank you so much. That was really great. I have sort of two questions which are kind of related. One, which is that the discussion of truth and falsity that you and Adorno seem to be engaged in is very different from the sort of traditional epistemology. And I think that related to that is that you know, the question of truth really doesn't seem, as far as you're concerned, doesn't really seem to have very much to do with the factual, with what is a fact or not. And I'm wondering whether you think it's important to just sort of jump over discussions of the factual, or do you think it's important to basically critique the very concept of the factual itself?
I would say that I don't think what I'm presenting is at odds with dealing with facts. You know, if we recognize truth as a process in Hegel of transformation and subjectivity and objectivity, a moment that expresses that process is facts. You know, I was thinking after reading Lukács for the reading group that actually it's the antinomy that appears between fact and value that itself is expressing what Adorno is describing as the problem. The fact that facts appear on one side as cold, hard, objective data, and value appears as a merely subjective desire to interpret the facts. That distinction between facts and their interpretation, the fact that those two things appear as unmediated and separate, is exactly the breakdown of the bourgeois dialectic. For Hegel, there would be no, of course Hegel is concerned with facts. There's no distinction between freedom and facts. Freedom must deal with the facts and transform the facts in its unfolding. And so once again, the kind of mind-blowing thing about Adorno's approach is that he's not only providing answers to these questions, he's saying the reason certain questions come up is a function of the problem I'm describing. And one of the ways that comes up is that we think to talk about transformation and subjectivity means to ignore the facts. Whereas the point is, why do the facts seem opposed to talking about transformation and subjectivity? And that might be a function of the breakdown of Hegel's dialectic, if that makes sense, Tom.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Dane?
Yeah, can you hear me, Omer?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I just wanted to ask about two things about the dialectic with Adorno. First, I wanted to know what you think the relationship of the dialectic of enlightenment is to a lot of what you were saying, because this presentation, I think, dealt very well with the negative dialectic. And I'm wondering how this other concept, which of course is importantly related, but I wanted to know how the dialectic of enlightenment that Horkheimer and Adorno describe, how this fits into what you were saying. And then the other final thing I wanted to ask was, do you think there are areas where the dialectic for Adorno is in important respects different from the dialectic for Marx? Do you think there's a change in some respect between the two of them? And I just want to get your comments on these two things.
Sure. So dialectic of enlightenment. Yeah, I mean, the way I was thinking of this teaching was to provide as broad a framework as possible for someone to be able to approach any of Adorno's work. You know, prior to this, I was going through negative dialectics. You know, that's a dense text. But I found it helpful after writing this that if I kept the basic points in mind, that Adorno is expressing the disintegration of bourgeois thought, the difficulty of negative dialectics is kind of grounded in something. In terms of dialectic of enlightenment, I was explicitly cribbing from it. And in that book, Adorno kind of frames, you know, what is the dialectic of enlightenment? And it's something I kind of said in other language, which is how does a kind of process in history, a point in history, the Enlightenment, as a movement, not as a static state of being, that was supposed to overcome things like fear, myth, superstition. That was the realm of ancient society. And the fact that there's been a subjective emancipation in bourgeois society, the extent to which we can reflect on our social practices and change our circumstances, this seems to suggest that what we're overcoming is fated kind of tragedy at the hands of the gods or at the hands of nature. That the idea of the Enlightenment is a self-legislation of human society and transformation of objectivity. And the question, the way Adorno and Horkheimer posed it then, is how does it come to be that that same process, which was supposed to emancipate us from domination, is now the thing that is dominating us, is creating a second nature that appears as unchangeable as the ancient world might have appeared to its people. That if bourgeois society was about conscious freedom, that same project is what now appears to deny us freedom. That same project of freeing ourselves from fear is now what is constituting kind of, as Adorno puts it, free-floating anxiety. I guess my thing with that work is that it's usually read as kind of anti-enlightenment. And if you read it that way in terms of how postmodernists take it up, it becomes, you know, kind of typical and uninteresting, which is that the Enlightenment, you know, was doomed to failure or something. That's not exactly the point. It's really to stress that contradiction, that what was once supposed to free us and emancipate us is now the very force that's dominating us. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that's.
Oh yeah, and then Marx, the question of the Marx. Yeah, I would say that in terms of the relationship to Hegel, what Adorno is doing is reading Hegel through Marx. That, you know, the idea that, and this is something I think about in terms of how Platypus approaches Hegel, which is the way I try to lay out Hegel as this radical Hegel is the way I think Marx himself saw Hegel. That the point of Platypus is not Hegel in himself, the best reading of Hegel, but Marx's kind of taking up of Hegel and what Hegel meant to Marx. And similarly, Adorno is treating Hegel from the perspective of Marx. But yes, obviously, you know, the real point is the disintegration of socialism and socialist politics has made the problem appear differently. Whereas for Marx, you know, the workers' movement, I was talking to Danny about this, I don't think the workers' movement for Marx is the unproblematic inheritance of German idealism. Rather, it's the inheritance of the crisis of German idealism. And it's working through the fact that there's the proletariat's own social action appears to it as a force out of its control. For Adorno, that task is not even there. It's not even being posed. You know, in imaginative excess, as he say, the workers used to mistrust the intellectuals because they might betray the revolution. Now they mistrust the intellectuals because they might want it. And so that kind of opens up a whole host of problems. So I would say, you know, if the dialectic for these people is not an abstract method, but is something that reality itself demands. For Hegel, it's the history of the bourgeois revolution. It's that demands a dialectical treatment. For Marx, it's the proletarian's own action that demands dialectical treatment. For Adorno, it's looking at a kind of disintegrated reality in which it seems like both Marxism and bourgeois thought are at stake and have kind of disintegrated. It's a dialectical treatment of both Marxism and bourgeois thought through Marxism. That's the kind of reality Adorno is is attempting to deal with dialectically. Yeah, I don't know, it's a big question. I hope I've kind of spoken to it, but for the sake of this, I was really trying to actually emphasize the similarities, so we could kind of, through Adorno, get at Marx's relationship to Hegel. But I would say, yeah, there's this Adorno's work is about what is the possibility of Marxism in a context which its conditions of possibility, a working class struggling for socialism, has kind of dissipated. Cool. Alana?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for your talk, it's very interesting. I'm just wondering, when you said Adorno was not actually against practice, it sounds like people think he was, and I'm wondering how people come to think he was against practice, because to me it seems clear in his writing that he sees practice as being very relevant in his dialectics.
Right.
So I just wonder how that misunderstanding came about.
Yeah, I think it's something similar to someone else's question, which is the fact that he's, we have such a kind of vulgar notion of critique now, which we think is just to say that something is wrong. I think I once said that we're often critical of the things we're most sympathetic to, because what critique means is not like rejecting things, but trying to grasp how something might express the problem or the contradiction. And so I think Adorno's treatment of the 60s is taken as a kind of ivory tower intellectual bemoaning the kind of on-the-ground shock troops or something. But yeah, exactly, that what he's really saying is that they're falling below the level of what practice should mean. And that actually his thought is itself kind of undermined by the fact that there is no real practical activity politically in those terms. But yeah, I think it is this kind of bad reading of what critique means, which is that because Adorno is like treating actionism, as he calls it, as a symptom, it's a rejection of practice or action. And I think it's also maybe how the New Left wanted to read his work, to deal with like what he's really presenting dialectically, might be too difficult to apply to a kind of propagandistic like action model, because then you would actually have to reflect on what he's saying and reflect on your own activity. Whereas, Adorno's accusation of pseudo-activity and actionism is it's driven by its own lack of reflection. And in that sense, that's all he was trying to provide, not like a kind of scolding to the students to not do that, but to simply reflect. Does that answer your question?
Okay, thank you. Yes, that answers my question. Thank you.
Sure. I think maybe it was a small group today, so yeah, I think that's it. Any last questions before we can?
Yeah, I guess I'll bring one up.
Sure.
How would you then relate Adorno to people who drew from kind of the Hegelian, from the existentialist tradition, but did break with Heidegger in certain ways, like Sartre, especially in his later years?
I mean, so are you suggesting that like Adorno is harsh on Heidegger, and so was he harsh on Sartre?
Basically arguing if there would be a distinction given the fact that Heidegger is seen to take an anti-humanist turn, or Sartre is seen to take a more humanist turn when Heidegger gives a critique of Sartre's understanding. Of course, Sartre's own understanding and Heidegger's both take a variety of changes over the years.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. It's a good. I was kind of skimming through negative dialectics again as I was reading this, and I'm trying to remember the discussion there. I mean, to speak shorthand with you, Al, I would say on one level, I think another misconception is that Adorno is like kind of rejecting Heidegger. I think Adorno actually thinks Heidegger is posing a really fundamental problem about the appearance of bourgeois philosophy and bourgeois social life in the context of its undermining. So I think his critique of Heidegger is actually, once again, very sympathetic. He doesn't, he thinks that Heidegger's solution is a kind of abdication of the problem, but he thinks the fact that Heidegger has to come up with such a solution, i.e. being, as a refutation of all Western metaphysics, expresses the fact that the dialectic has really disintegrated. If being is supposed to replace a subject-object dialectic, for Adorno, that's a kind of desperate philosophical act to kind of reconcile the problem itself, which is the fact that our subjectivity seems to be opposed to objectivity. And I think that's his treatment of the existentialists too, is that they, in the realm of individual freedom, try and resolve the problem they are expressing, which is why does individual freedom appear opposed to collective freedom? The other way you can frame existentialism and Heidegger is explicitly coming out of the failure of the revolution. That for Adorno, it's the failure of, how does he put it, realizing philosophy, realizing the subject-object dialectic in revolution. When that fails, you get a kind of radical philosophical critique of all of bourgeois society, all of the thought of bourgeois freedom, the subject-object dialectic, and it's resolved at the level of existence or being. And so Adorno's real point is not that this is more false than what I'm saying or more wrong than Marxism, but rather as a symptom, what does it mean that Heidegger comes up with such a solution to the philosophical problem of subject and object, and similarly with existentialism? Is that addressing your question?
I believe so. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one more.
Thank you very much.
Sorry? Someone said something.
I just wanted to add one of the things that I noticed that always struck me in reading Adorno is the contrast of Hegel, that like in the phenomenology, I actually was able to say the word, Hegel talks about how sort of like the object is inadequate somehow to its concept, and that's the basic, and the dialectic is really grounded on that inadequacy. And at various points, Adorno seems to say that in fact the problem is reversed. The concept is inadequate to the object, and I'm wondering how that formulation fits into your understanding of Adorno's dialectic.
Tom, I was actually thinking about this question because you asked it last time. I had a feeling it might come up again. So this is funny that you brought it up. I'm glad. So the question is around Adorno's language of the primacy of the object, right? Kind of as Tom described it. And I would say that actually the primacy of the object is the problem to be overcome. It's not an assertion of what is always true, that our thinking lags behind objectivity. Rather, that's how capitalism appears. That our subjective consciousness lags behind the objective phenomena of society. And for Adorno, to assert the kind of primacy of the object, or how people put it, the inadequacy of the concept with the object, that's not a kind of merely abstract philosophical formal claim. That's about history and society, meaning that saying that the fact that objective reality appears more primary, or that our concepts can't get objective reality, is itself the problem that needs to be overcome. It's not a kind of assertion of a static truth. Does that address your question?
That was really nicely articulated. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, if there's no more questions, thanks everyone for joining. Platypus members, you can take up the discussion on the list if there's more questions. But yeah, thanks guys.
Thanks, Omar. That really was brilliant.
Thank you.
Yeah.